Hi, everybody. Some notes, some extra explanation of the slides from class on Thursday. One of the students, one of you reached out to me and said that you thought it would be useful to spend some time on several of the slides next week. And I thought, what the heck, why don't I just put together a PowerPoint recording, and you can see perhaps what one of them looks like, what one of them sounds like, and I can go over a few points that I didn't get to on Thursday with regards to the slides. So starting here on the slide with regards to teams and emotional intelligence, we did one version of an emotional intelligence test, and we've talked about emotional intelligence earlier in the semester with certain categories and certain sort of definitions of emotional intelligence. This I want to give you a different version of emotional intelligence, and this is from, as you can see at the bottom of the screen, this is from Daniel Goleman's work, who is probably the most known researcher or management consultant who works on questions of emotional intelligence. And this is from an article he wrote in 1998, or at least was published in 1998, called What Makes a Leader? And in his work on effective leaders in 200 large global companies, he sums up emotional intelligence as being composed of self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, and social skill. And his definition of these: self-awareness is an ability to understand your moods and drives and how you affect others with those moods and your drives. Self-regulation amounts to an ability to control or redirect your impulses and moods, and a tendency to suspend judgment, to think before acting, to be able to sort of step back when your mind is racing and you're jumping to a conclusion or risking jumping to a conclusion or risking jumping right into an argument or a discussion. The ability to step back and really try to hear everybody's viewpoint before you actually rush to judgment. Motivation is a passion to work for reasons beyond money or status, and a tendency to pursue goals with energy and persistence. Emotional intelligence, in other words, is highly characterized by what we might call intrinsic motivation. Internal drives for success and accomplishment are closely linked to high emotional intelligence. Empathy, the ability to understand emotions of others, skill in treating people according to their emotional reactions. The second part is kind of crucial. Many leaders and many of us, just human beings, many of us struggle actually with treating people according to their emotional reactions. Think of the discomfort many of us have when somebody is very upset, somebody is crying, somebody is acting in some kind of an emotional way that makes us uncomfortable. We often tend to avoid those people, or we tell them to behave differently. Emotional intelligence and empathy within it really means that you have a high skill in treating people according to their emotional reactions, and you can bend and flex in that way. Social skill, proficiency in managing relationships, building networks, and finding common ground and building rapport. And a great quote at the bottom: it's not that IQ and technical skills are irrelevant, they do matter, but mainly as threshold capabilities. That is, they are the entry-level requirements for executive positions. This is research done on individual leaders in 200 large global companies. My argument and my purpose for putting it into the International Organizational Behavior class and bringing it back to talk about teams is, while there isn't as much research on this, I'm convinced that highly effective teams exhibit team emotional intelligence. In other words, there is a team-wide competency, or at least concern and urge for competency in all of these areas. In all of these areas, I think it's obvious. If every team member is exhibiting effectively these kinds of competencies, teamwork is going to sing. if you think about the Everest case, and you think about the Sun Micro case, you can see how Brett and his co-authors in managing multicultural teams come to their argument. They argue that in their research, looking at multicultural teams, and you in the Everest simulation were multicultural teams, the teams that you're working in right now for your make the case final deliverable in IOB, those are also multicultural teams. The first barrier is direct versus indirect communication. In other words, and we saw this in Hofstede also when we looked at the Hofstede continuums. Direct versus indirect communication. To what extent do we say exactly what we mean, or to what extent do we use indirect means to communicate our message? Another way of thinking about this that you might have heard is high context versus low context communication. Low context communication characterizes many Americans, or at least it's almost a myth of American life. In other words, we say what we mean, we say it straightforward. It doesn't matter in what context you say it, it means the same thing. High context communication is more indirect. It is saying things in a roundabout fashion, but the entire social context allows you to understand what that message is, but it requires you to be able to discern and decode the entire context. Verbal fluency and accents, I think that one is pretty obvious. Different attitudes toward hierarchy. Again, we can go back to Hofstede and think about power distance. It's by and large the same sort of insight. And finally, conflicting decision-making norms, hierarchy versus flat ideas of the way decisions get made, for example, is part of that. What the identification of these barriers is nice, but the authors do go on and talk more about how you actually use these. What makes these practical? Practically, what can you do about them? The first intervention type when faced with these barriers is adaptation, which is the leader. This is all about what leaders of teams do, or team members do, but think mostly about team leader choices at this point. Adaptation is working with or around differences. By working with or around differences, you're not trying to change those differences. You are accepting that they exist, and you're trying to work with them. If someone chooses and is more comfortable with indirect communication, you work with that, or you work around it, but you don't try to change that person's preference for indirect communication. It may be more obvious when you think about accents. You can't lose an accent. It's very, very difficult to do that, and you have to work with or around those differences in that case. The first intervention type is you adapt. What do you do in face of these four barriers? You adapt. The second one that the authors identify is structural intervention, which is reorganizing to reduce friction. Reorganizing to reduce friction. It could be a matter of putting subgroups together who don't have barriers. Of course, that might create other kinds of barriers. It could involve reorganizing the physical space of the team, such as some of you suggested would have been a good move for Greg James moving forward. So structural is the second intervention type. The third intervention type is managerial intervention. And this amounts to making final decisions without the team. In other words, there is a choice, a team leader choice in a team where you're seeking consensus, full consensus-based decision-making. If the barriers are so strong to prevent true consensus decision-making, then a choice that you have as a team leader is making final decisions without the team, and announcing that, of course, announcing that this is no longer a consensus-based decision-making process, that you, as the leader, are going to make the decision. A fourth intervention type, sort of generically, which is what these are, a fourth intervention type is exit. In other words, a voluntary or involuntary removal of a team member. If one of the team members, by being taken off the team, if that solves some or many of these barriers, then sometimes a team leader chooses this. So broadly speaking, when do you use these? You use adaptation when members are willing to acknowledge cultural differences and how to live with them. You're willing to acknowledge cultural differences and how to live with them. If it takes longer to get work done in Dubai, so be it. We'll all agree to that, and we'll all learn how to live with that. You use structural intervention when the team has obvious subgroups. And they're clinging to stereotypes. You have to mix up the team. You have to move team members. You have to do something structural to break up the subgroups. Some of you began to recommend that in class on Thursday with regards to actions that Greg could take. Managerial intervention, very rarely should you choose this, particularly if your full intent is that this team should be a high-functioning collaborative work team where consensus should rule the day. You don't want to create dependency on the manager or leader in this case, and by intervening and making final decisions with the team, without the team, you're actually kind of enabling dysfunctional behavior if that team requires consensus-based decision-making for full effectiveness. So you use it very, very rarely, perhaps with a new team, but beyond that, you want to think very, very closely. Again, if the team requires consensus-based decision-making, which not every team or group requires, but if it does, you got to be really careful about stepping in and taking on this role of decision-maker. It'll create dependence and codependence in the team. Exit or voluntary or involuntary exit when emotions are running very high. None of the other three options, intervention types, seem like it'll work. There's too much face to be lost on all sides, and there's an urgency, which requires some kind of quick action, which only voluntary and involuntary removal might affect. So you have the intervention type that we just talked about. You have when to use, which we've talked about. And then this slide just talks a little bit about good practice notes. In other words, what are some generally accepted good practices when it comes to the intervention type and how to use it. The adaptation option, you use it when you have enough time, when you can train and you can build a common language. So in other words, the good practice note is you use it or deploy it only if you have the time and the resources to make this kind of adaptation work. The structural intervention reorganize is it's a good practice to think about using it when deadlines are urgent. The managerial intervention, good practice notes. If you're going to use it, you need to make a transition plan away from the managerial intervention mode. You need to make that transition plan explicit and make an explicit set of rules about decision making and early team product. In other words, once you've decided that the manager is going to, that you or the leader is going to make the decision for the team, you need to make an explicit set of rules about how that, therefore, is going to happen. Otherwise, it's going to get confusing. Good practice notes when it comes to exiting. You want to think really hard about what you're trying to solve for and whether the removal of a team member is really going to solve it. And you also want to do some contingency planning. In other words, what might you lose through the solution by removing a member? What's the downside of the solution? And lay it out in columns, the pros and cons of making the decision. Weigh it out. And think hard about what skills you're removing from the team. Generally, team members are brought into a team because they have certain skills, and removing a team member may mean that you lose critical competencies in the team, which means, obviously, you may have to seek another team member, or you may have to change the team's task. So all of this is good practice as it relates to choosing the exit intervention type. This is a little bit more generic when we're talking about team effectiveness and things that good teams and effective teams do. Before the work starts, you have all of these steps that good, smart teams undertake. A couple of notes here that might not be obvious. If you look at interdependence, where it says pooled, sequential, and reciprocal, what does that mean? The sequential. Let's start with sequential because that's, I think, pretty easy to understand. Think of the classic assembly line as sequential interdependence. In other words, each person in an assembly line has their own task, but in sequence they all have to do their tasks. If anybody doesn't put the right bolt into the right fender of the car, the whole car is going to fall apart whether you do your job or not further down the line, right? So that's sequential interdependence. Reciprocal interdependence is a task environment where what one team member does and the results of what that action is can cycle back or loop back and affect what another team member does, and so you can get you may be involved in loops of nonlinearity where what I do affects what you do affects what I do, and if it's that kind of interdependence, you want to recognize the fact that you're going to have procedures and processes in place, as well as monitoring and evaluation measures to make sure that you're catching the effects of that reciprocity. So sequential and reciprocal, reciprocal, if you need a very sort of clear example of reciprocal interdependence, you can go back to the classic example of the basketball team. What I do as I'm dribbling the ball or moving down the court is going to affect what another team member does or should do in the coming seconds ahead, and so on and so forth. It's all reciprocal. It's all reciprocal on a soccer team or a football international football team. So that kind of image of the reciprocal interdependence characterizes a lot of sports teams. Pooled interdependence, you want to think more of like parallel processing, where it's not linear, it's not an assembly line, nor is it reciprocal, nor is it what one person does affects what another person does, but it's pooled, kind of parallel, people working in parallel to achieve an overall objective. Maybe a good example of this is, if one of Ms's objectives is in a given semester getting you as a student through a learning process for that semester that is top notch, and think of all the people that actually contribute to that. Professors contribute to that, financial aid contributes to that, student services contributes to that, student clubs contribute to that, CACS contributes to that. We're not in a linear line. We're not in a reciprocal relationship. We're in a pooled interdependence relationship in order to succeed, in order for you to succeed as a student that semester. I think the rest of this is pretty self-explanatory, going down to align rewards, the third bullet down, and then the sub-bullet match system to task interdependence. All I mean by this is, or all that is meant by this is, you want to, and we've talked a lot about motivation, incentive, and reward systems already, Lincoln Electric specifically, but several times beyond that. Matching your reward system to task interdependence, you want to be really careful. If what's important is the overall team performance, and if the team is importantly interdependent, and if the team requires, if the team product requires all team members working together and not just pooled interdependence where everybody working apart is going to do just fine for the purposes of task accomplishment. If there's a lot of interdependence, then you want to think about rewards that are more team-based, frankly. Rewards and incentives that encourage and lead people to work together, as opposed to individual rewards which encourage people to achieve their own individual goals, but that could be at the expense of the team. The Everest simulation contained some simulated aspects of this where all of the team members had individual goals. Again, you can think of the sports team analogy where, you have a pretty mediocre basketball team and you bring in LeBron James and pay LeBron James much, much more than anybody else on the team in the hopes that he can raise the standard of the team. And he can. He clearly did with the Cleveland Cavaliers this last season. But largely that kind of individual reward when you're expecting team performance usually backfires. In terms of launching the team, I don't really have much to say about this. I think that it's pretty straightforward, but you'll let me know that. Doing the work also, I think it's pretty straightforward. The kinds of things that are necessary to do, how to do them, doing them really well, somewhat different, but at least having the knowledge that these things should be part of what you're doing in your teams. Even in your make your case teams, your study teams, not all of these things are necessarily going to apply to your teams in IOB, but a lot of these do actually apply, and it'd be a good thing if you're not already to have conversations right now in your teams about how well you're doing some of these things. Are you managing subgroup communications, for example? Do you have subgroups actually? And again, the inclination here at MIS and in school, and particularly given all of the backgrounds we have here that are largely intercultural, we like to largely say, no, we're okay. We don't have subgroups. We're intercultural. We've lived elsewhere. We've lived in many cultures, or at least one other culture. But it's not always true, you guys. And so really stepping back and challenging yourselves to do it even better, if I can put it that way, would be a great thing this semester, because as I keep saying, this is a safe space, much safer than any place that you're going to find when you leave MIS. That last note, let me just go back to that. I guess the other thing that I think is important on this is when you do get into a leadership or management role when you leave MIS, you will at some point in your career have the opportunity to put a team together. And so you can use this 2x2 to actually think about how to compose your group and team and what it means about team development moving forward. Thinking very explicitly and consciously about team composition using this matrix, I would argue, can help you in the work on micro and some takeaway ideas. I want to conclude here with a little bit more on Chris Argyris. Again, I like this quote from page 4 of the article I asked you to read. Solving problems is important, but if learning is to persist, managers and employees must also look inward. They need to reflect critically on their own behavior, identify the ways they often inadvertently contribute to the organization's problems, and then change how they act. In particular, they must learn how the very way they go about defining and solving problems can be a source of problems in its own right. And the classic sort of tool around this idea is single, double, and triple loop learning. I talked about single and double loop learning a little bit in class, and the article that you read talks a little bit about it, but there's also a thing called triple loop learning, and here's the way this works. Think about in the workplace accomplishing something. Every organization and every team and every group and every department is trying to do something, right? So you think about every social change program is trying to do something. Every business is trying to do something. So at the far left, you have every group or organization or social group has a purpose or a goal. They tend to translate these into objectives, which are more concrete and closer in time to what do we want to do now. You implement. There's always some kind of an implementation to get towards that objective, and then you look at the results and see how it goes. Here's an example. Most businesses, many businesses, not all, but many businesses would say that their most fundamental purpose and goal is to maximize their profit for shareholders. That's the purpose and goal. A particular organization, a particular company might choose an objective for a particular year or 2 or 5. That objective, in order to maximize profits, an organization might choose to break into new markets. There's a lot of different ways to maximize profits, is what I'm somewhat hinting at here. Imagine that the organization chooses through contextual analysis and trends analysis, market analysis, saying that breaking into new markets, Lincoln Electric breaking into Indonesia might be a really good way to maximize global profits. You create an action plan to break into new markets, and imagine, just play a thought experiment, that you implement the action plan, and the result is, nope, we're actually losing money. So we started off wanting to maximize profits. We decided the objective was going to be to break into new markets. We developed an action plan to do that, and the result, we're losing money. Certainly, we're not maximizing profit. Now we have we have three choices at this point. The first is single loop learning. Single loop learning would say, let's improve the plan. There must be something wrong with the plan. There must be something wrong about our implementation. We need to maximize profits. We're breaking into new markets. There must be something awry with the action plan. So single loop learning is largely going back. An example of single loop learning is going back and rethinking the action plan. You don't go back and rethink anything else. Double loop learning would take you back and say, well, maybe it's not the implementation. Maybe the objective is wrong. So in double loop learning, you're going back and questioning whether your original thought about what a good objective is, what we should do, is actually correct. That's double loop learning. Maybe instead of breaking into new markets, we should restructure and reduce costs, for example. Those are two different ways of maximizing profits. You can break into new markets, or we can stay right where we are, same markets, and let's restructure and reduce costs. Both would maximize profits. Triple loop learning is even deeper. Triple loop learning is going all the way out and questioning the actual purpose or goal. Going all the way back to the start and saying, is our purpose or goal actually important? Perhaps instead of maximizing profit, our goal should be triple bottom line. Here's another example. An MBA, imagine that the purpose or goal of an MBA program is an MBA degree that competes on the same terms as Harvard, Sloan, Wharton, etc. That could be a perfectly reasonable stated purpose or goal for a new MBA program. Your objective might be to ensure that MBA students are exposed to all of the most important concepts related to international organizational behavior. In other words, the objective for an organizational behavior class, an IOB or an IOB track or an IOB competency, let's call it that. Your objective could be to ensure MBA students are exposed to all of the most important concepts related to international organizational behavior. You would go ahead and construct your IOB syllabus accordingly, and you would look at your results and imagine that the results are rotten course evaluations. So single, double, and triple loop learning with regards to that IOB course would look something like this. Single loop, I might go back and revise the syllabus, try it again next semester. Double loop might be, let's go back. Maybe this thing about exposed to all the most important concepts, maybe it wasn't the right way to go. Let's choose a subset of concepts and allow students space to pursue their own individual passions aligned with their needs. Maybe that's going to improve the course and improve my course evaluations. Going back all the way, triple loop would be develop a new notion and vision of what an MBA degree is about and whether IOB is even necessary inside of that degree program. So another example is all I'm trying to show you of using single, double, and triple loop learning. Single loop learning, again, in the workplace and as it relates to organizational action, is fundamentally this. Single loop, let's redo our plan. Let's recalibrate our plan. Our goals are fine. Our purpose is fine. The kinds of results that we are hoping for is fine. It's got to be something in our implementation. Single loop. Double loop, let's go back and see whether our objective was the right one to begin with. Maybe we're pursuing the wrong objective. Triple loop, maybe our purpose or goal is incorrect.